this statement. It's almost in everyone's bylaws. Wherever there's a body of 6 members and there's a priesthood member, there exists the church. Almost everyone has that. But this is where I actually want to spend more time, is question number 5. Because I feel like part of why Daniel and I felt that this class was important was because it went against what we had traditionally been taught. Now, some of this maybe for others, you've already known this, but for Daniel and I, maybe for other people, this is kind of a new concept. So this is the question that was asked of the RLDS church. How could the church reorganize itself? Can a stream rise higher than its fountain? And again, fountain is like the source of a river. So how can the river rise higher than its source? If the priesthood was disorganized, did not paramount right remain with some one person, holding the highest authority, upon whom the duty rested to set the house of God in order, to ordain men to the higher offices in the priesthood, and organize the quorums, and to whom the prerogative to ordain all others belonged, and without whose sanction nothing could legally be done to build up the kingdom of God upon the earth. So this is an important question, because the way I have been traditionally taught or understood is this is kind of how I view the church today. That we're waiting for this one person to come, mainly a prophet or something, maybe Jesus himself, and that you have to have that in order to set the church in order, because the lesser cannot ordain the greater. Has anyone ever heard something like that before? That's how I understood it for the longest time until I started going through this. But that's actually not how the RLDS church viewed it at the beginning. And so Joseph is going to answer that. But before we do, I think it's really good to have an illustration. So I want you to picture the source of this stream is the mountain. And what the Mormons are saying is this right here is the Melchizedek priesthood. It's the prophet. This stream is never going to go higher than that mountain. And that's their claim. Basically what they're trying to get at is, well, we had Brigham, he's the prophet. You should accept him as being the one in whom you need in order to set the church in order. So this is how Joseph is going to respond. And this is very similar, if you remember from last week, to what Gurley said and what Briggs said. And Joseph is using the same kind of thinking. The church was organized in 1830 with 6 members upon whom the eldership had been conferred by God. Joseph and Oliver were the first and second elders of the church. Okay, real quick. Anything that's in parentheses is Joseph Smith III's. He put that in there. He put it in the reference. That's not Andrew. If you see anything in brackets like down here, that is Andrew, just because some of the words that he uses, well, we don't talk like that today, and they don't make sense. So, okay, so in 14 years, thousands were baptized. All officers were ordained under the hands of these 2 men, directly or indirectly by virtue of the command of God. The fountain whence this stream flowed was the will and commandments of God. The stream was the priesthood, the Melchizedek, in which is comprised all grades of authority, and any one of which is competent to the regulating and setting in order all the rest. And we'll dive into that a little bit more. So he's saying even if you just had an elder present, if all you had was an elder, you could set the church in order. A command of God to do anything always conveys the right to do it and guarantees to those commanded the powers necessary to carry into effect the command. Hence, the command originally given to organize the church conveyed the right and granted the necessary power to do it. No attempt to cause the stream to rise higher than its fountain has ever been made in the reorganization or by the reorganization. And here, and again, I really encourage you to read the letter, because he goes more and more into depth of why you shouldn't just be waiting for one person and how God never relies on one person to do his work. God's going to do his work because he's God. He doesn't need you necessarily to do it. He's going to do it, right? That's kind of the theme. And that's always the pattern. So the mistake that those who so frequently use this axiom, a stream cannot rise higher than its fountain, have always and persistently made is that they have located this fountain in a man, authority attaching as a personal prerequisite, and therefore he could confer nothing he himself did not hold, forgetting an important fact that the law, the command, the Holy Ghost was and is the fountain, the priesthood, the stream, mend the channels in which the stream runs. And basically what he's going to go on to say is if it was any other way, God would basically be divesting himself of his authority to be God. Because he's waiting for, he couldn't have restored the church without Joseph. It's kind of the way I would take that. Would we say that God needed Joseph to do it, or that God chose someone who was willing to be used to do it? And think of, Moses or Alma the Elder in the Book of Mormon, where it seems to be this unusual pattern. But God's not necessarily waiting for Alma to come along or Joseph to come along. God is choosing someone who is finally willing and ready to do his work. And so just using this thing again, this visual. So traditionally, as I've understood it, we claim the Melchizedek is the mountain. And so if all you have is lesser offices, even that of an elder, priest, teacher, or deacon, there's no way you can overcome this mountain. There's no way you can set the church in order because you're not high enough. I don't know if, again, anyone heard that before? Okay, yeah, I see some nodding, some smirks. But no, what Joseph Smith III is saying is God is the mountain. And he can do anything anytime he wants to. The stream is actually the authority of priesthood. And the men are the channels in which the stream runs through. God doesn't need the channels. He just happens to be giving us the water, right? The authority is just happening to be flowing through us. But the fountain, the source, is ultimately God. And so if God says, hey, I'm commanding you to organize or reorganize the church like he did with Jason and Gurley and the other men and women of the church in 1853, then they can do that because he commanded it. Now, while that's true, it also can be taken, you have to be careful about that because you can use that to justify just about anything. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But so Joseph says, for some reason, the church was not prepared by an intimate acquaintance with these provisions. So basically, the dark and cloudy day didn't have to happen. If the church had known about this when Joseph Smith Jr. was killed, then they could have organized the church. They didn't need to wait for a man. And I think we find this time and time again, even in our culture now, is we still look for an individual to lead us sometimes. We're still looking for that one. And that for them, they look to Joseph almost like he was their savior instead of looking to Jesus. And so when he was taken away, they didn't know where to turn. And if we know where to turn, we are acquainted with these provisions, then maybe we shouldn't be in the condition we're in today. At least that's what Joseph was saying back then, or my interpretation of what he's saying. So then he goes on a little bit further, and he uses these scriptural references basically to say the priesthood has power, the Melchizedek priesthood, has power and authority over all offices of the church. Another clause provides that an elder has right to officiate in his stead when the high priest is not present. Another, still more specific, provides that the high priest and elder are to administer in spiritual things agreeably to the covenants and commandments of the church, and they have a right to officiate in all these offices of the church when there are no higher authorities present. And just to be a little bit more clear, he's going to say it very clearly here. This conveys to us clearly that if the Melchizedek priesthood is present in any of its offices, the right to organize or to reorganize, the power to establish, build up, and confirm all the church are there. And if, this is the part that's really important, so I tried to highlight it, and if directed by command of God to perform all the work necessary, then you can do it. And that's what Joseph Smith III is saying what happened in 1853 when the RLDS Church was formed. They had people who had adhered to the covenants of God. They remained true to the gospel restored in 1830. There were more than enough elders present. and it was their duty to come and ask the Lord what he would have them to do, God responded and said, I'm going to show you how to organize. But here's the difference, and we'll kind of get to this a little bit later, is they didn't go out trying to organize. It wasn't their desire. They weren't trying to engineer something. God opened the way for them. He showed them how to do it. It wasn't by their own making. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this here in a second. So the sixth question, where was the priesthood during the time of the dark and cloudy day? And basically, again, he says the priesthood has been present with those who basically remained faithful. But so far as delegated authority from God makes priesthood, the priesthood right to act in the name of the church as minister for Christ, remain with the faithful elder, priest, teacher, and deacon. And basically, he says there were more than enough to do this work. So with that, I know I'm kind of moving through this very quickly, but I want us to have time to talk. So how did the reorganization handle factional priesthood? That's one of the big elephants in the room that we deal with today. And I know that there are things that are different between where we are now and where they were back then. But there are a lot of similarities. So just consider for a moment what we started this presentation with, and that's with Briggs and Gurley. Remember that Briggs was ordained a high priest under James J. Strang, and Z.H. Gurley was ordained a president of 70 under J.J. Strang. Now, I know that these are anomalies, but these two men kept those offices when they went into the RLDS church. In fact, when they were having their debate on who should preside over the conference in April of 1853, it was between three men because they couldn't decide who had the highest authority. Because Briggs was a high priest, a man named Deem was a high priest, and Gurley was a president of 70. And so they couldn't decide who should be presiding over that conference. But ultimately, they would choose Briggs. In fact, Briggs presided over all the other conferences too. The June and October 1852 conferences were presided over by Briggs. Again, under his authority as a high priest, which he received under J.J. Strang. Yes.
And J.J. Strang was ordained in what organization?
He was ordained, well, here's the thing. All I know is when he was baptized. He was baptized in February of 1844, so just a few months before Joseph was killed. I am going to make an assumption, which you probably shouldn't do, that he was ordained to something under the original organization, because when he says he has a letter from Joseph Smith saying that he would be the next prophet of the church, and people believe him. So I have a hard time imagining that they would believe someone who wasn't already a priesthood member to some extent. He probably was something. I don't know if he was a high priest. I don't know if he was an elder. And maybe if someone is more versed in church history, they could tell me. But they do believe that he's the prophet president of the church. In fact, we'll read a statement here just in a couple slides from Briggs saying that that's how he viewed him. But yes, he probably could trace his authority back to the original church, which is important. Briggs. Or I just called you Briggs. Brian Monday. It's the B. It's the B.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
There you go. He was ordained right shortly after. I think he was ordained, baptized in February and ordained in March.
Okay.
An elder. He was an elder in the
original church.
Original church.
Okay, that's good to know. Okay, and that was not uncommon for someone to get ordained or baptized and then ordained like almost immediately after. So, but he must have been very charismatic because he gathered quite a bit of a following. So this next part is written by Jason Briggs, and this comes from the Temple Lot case. So he has left the church at this point. He actually left the church in 1885 because Joseph Smith III allowed William Smith to come into the church, and he had problems with that. William Smith at one time had, if he wasn't practicing polygamy, he was saying it was of the Lord, and that was a problem with Jason. Now, he did repent of that, but there was some issues there, and so even though he expressed to Joseph Smith that I don't agree with this, Joseph Smith still brought in William, and so he left. And he left in 1885. And he'll bring that out here. But so the point was raised at that conference, meaning the June 1852 conference, and substantially decided, as I understood it, that James J. Strang and William Smith could ordain certain officers, could ordain elders, priests, and teachers. We derived that authority from the laws laid down in the books of authority in the church. So because they could trace their authority back to the original church, they understood that they still had some kind of authority to ordain people. And that's kind of important because we don't necessarily view it the same way today. Ordinations by James J. Strang and William Smith to the office of 70s, high priests, apostles, or patriarchs were not accepted. The ordinations by any parties to those offices with one, I put in brackets two because there were two exceptions actually, that being Briggs and Gurley. Single exception were not accepted. The office accepted was high priest, and then I added and president of 70. And this is the part, so basically I'm going to skip down here. When I joined the organization as led by James J. Strang, I accepted him as head of the church. That is, I accepted him as the leader and president of the church. So that's how they viewed him. They viewed him as having that kind of authority. One clear thing. When he realized their error, like it was under Brigham Young for a time, it was under Strang and William Smith for a time. As soon as he understood that they were in error, he left them. And I think that's also important to understand. And we have to remember the way that news and things traveled back then is going to be a lot different than what it is today. So there's a chance that they really didn't know what Strang was doing when they were being ordained under his hand. Yes, Brian.
Andrew, I was just curious. I understand Briggs being ordained the office of high priest,
yes.
And that is the one exception. I'm not following the president of 70. That's almost like a quorum leader, if you will. So why is that such a? Because
that's a good question.
Yes. Why are you making that such an important point, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I'm going to read this slide because I think it'll answer your question. Z.H. Gurley, who was raised up the branch at Palestine and who I answered I thought was a member of the Strang Church, was an authorized minister in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints before the death of Joseph Smith, an elder in that church at least. He, meaning Z.H. Gurley, was made a president of 70 after the death of Joseph Smith. And I think from that it is altogether likely that he was a 70 before the death of Joseph Smith. Still, I do not know. He was an elder in the original church. There is no manner of question about that. And that would give him the right to organize that branch. So he organized that branch in 1849, or maybe it was a little bit after he had already been ordained in Strang's church. Being an elder in the original church, but whether joining with Strang invalidated that eldership is a question to be determined, I suppose. But I will say that at the reorganization and at no time since have we understood that it invalidated an eldership in the church. That's why I'm bringing it up. These men, Briggs and Gurley, were baptizing people, they were confirming people, they were ordaining people under the authority of someone Strang. Those branches are actually the foundation of the RLDS church. They organized 3 of the 4 branches, I know for sure, and maybe they organized the other one as well, while they were under someone else's authority. So to me, this is important because sometimes today, and I'm not trying to project anything, but what I've heard from some is that if you've gone and joined this group or you've gone and joined that group, you've lost your authority. But that is not how they viewed it back then. He was still an elder. He still had the right to baptize and confirm and organize because he still could trace his eldership and his authority back to the original church. And I think that's really helpful in the discussions we have today. They didn't accept all these other higher offices. They didn't accept the bishop and the patriarch and the elder or the apostle, like what we just read. But they did understand that they could ordain elders, priests, teachers, and deacons. And I think that's important in our conversation. So just be thinking about this. I think this is part of the big point of all of this, and you'll get it at the end, is can we just ask God what he thinks? I have a horrible time of just doing things without asking the Lord because I think I already know. I don't know if anyone else is like that, but when I was pastor, sometimes people would come to me and they'd ask me something, and I feel like I had to immediately respond. And I didn't even ask the Lord about it. Or how many of you have had something happen in your life really quick, and rather than just stop and have a prayer that literally you could pray in less than a minute, we just go and we do it because we think we already know what we should be doing. And I've talked to people who they don't even really know why they believe what they believe. They just do it because someone else told them to. Well, okay. Can we get to a point where we could just ask God about some stuff, So hopefully wherever we stand, maybe we are right in our understanding, maybe we aren't. But is it such a scary thing to ask God, am I right? Is this the truth? Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox for a second. And so Briggs continues to write a little bit about his personal, and again, he mentions when he finds out the pretensions of these men that he rejected them. I did not understand at that time that my authority to build up the church was derived from William Smith or Strang. I had that authority by virtue of my eldership in the original church, which is what we just talked about. And then we have this for General Church Resolution that was passed shortly after Joseph Smith III had come back to the reorganization in 1860, or had come to the reorganization, I should say. Resolve further that a connection with those factions during the dark and cloudy day does not necessarily invalidate the priesthood, holding as we do that those factions could neither confer nor take away the priesthood. And then everyone's familiar with this verse. I'm sure you've been told it many times, section 119, about the importance of not being overly cautious, not being too careful, and that we don't hinder people from coming to the Lord because we think that, I don't know what we think, but that we're right and that they're wrong. So don't prevent their coming. So what's the issue then? So I've been told, why don't you, Andrew, okay, hold on. I don't want to say it like that. Andrew, why don't you just join the JCRB? Because maybe it would be easier for you. But they hear everything that I've said, and they take it as saying, we should join this organization or join that organization. And that's not what I'm saying at all. But I want us to consider a few things. And one of the biggest ones is people will sometimes ask, when the JCRB conference was first formed, where were the spiritual manifestations? So if you read in church history, you'd see that they had visions and dreams and singing in tongues, these amazing outward manifestations of the Spirit that probably very few of us have ever seen in person. I know my generation has not seen like any of those things. But maybe we've had dreams and visions, but you get the point. But if you were to ask someone in the JCRB, where were those spiritual manifestations? Where are your testimonies? They're going to say, we had those testimonies. And then they'll go share them with you. And so now we're going to debate about your testimony versus my testimony. And that's going nowhere fast because you can't really back that up. And so now it's basically who's more righteous. And obviously I'm more righteous than you. So it's probably my testimony that I should listen to and not yours. I mean, I feel like maybe that's kind of how we treat things sometimes. I know I have, so I'm guilty. But there's got to be another way to measure this. And to me, as I was reading through this and studying, there was a very clear indication that the Lord truly was there in 1853. And that was this, when we talked about this, how they were utterly opposed to each other, the bitterness. And then all of a sudden the Spirit comes and everything changes. And all diversity of opinion ceased, and the whole people were truly of one heart and one soul. So let me ask you this. What could be a greater example that God is truly in something, that the Spirit is truly present, than people who are divided becoming one? There is no human that can make that happen. Only God can do that. And I'm reminded even, in Kirtland, Riley Hall gave one of the most powerful sermons I've ever heard. And he mentioned in John chapter 9, the man who was blind from birth. And he made a point, if you know the story, Jesus heals him. The Pharisees are trying to catch Jesus and saying he's like a horrible person. And, the blind man eventually says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't care. All I know is I was once blind and now I see. And he mentioned, and something I had never considered before, is that maybe he was actually grateful for his blindness. Because when the day came that he was made whole, it testified so greatly of God's glory, grace, and power. And so maybe we could be similar. Maybe one day we'll say, I'm so glad we were so divided. I'm so glad we couldn't get along and we couldn't agree and we would keep divorcing from each other and breaking apart. Because once we were divided, but now we're made one. And the only way that could be possible is through Jesus and through his Spirit. So maybe we could have a similar testimony. So to me, you got to ask this question. Was the April 2008 JCRB conference united when they moved forward? And they were not. I wasn't there. I've heard people say it was 80-20, 60-40, 65-35. Okay, it doesn't matter. Was it 100%? No, it wasn't. And that's the key. If it was 100%, if the Lord was truly wanting us to move forward at that time, then it would need to be 100%. And so whatever happens in the future, and like we said, and like Jake mentioned in the beginning, we're not trying to start anything. I'm not about starting movements. I'm not about starting groups. I don't want to split anything. But if we ever got to a point where we wanted to reorganize, if there's even one person in the congregation, and I know everyone's got a person in their branch that they're always disagreeable on everything, right? There's always at least one. Even if that person disagrees, don't go forward. Unanimous consent. I know sometimes people like to debate on what consent means or common consent. Unanimous, 100%, everyone present. What made them different is that they kept coming back to the table. They were not okay with moving forward without their brothers and sisters. And so even if we did gather and we were really wanting to move forward, even if there's a few who disagree, can we keep meeting back, or meeting together? Maybe we have to wait longer. But we need to be one. I guess that's kind of the key. And so this brings up this scripture from John 17. I feel is really important. Neither pray I for these alone, but for them also which shall believe on me through their word, that they all may be one. As you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us. So this is Jesus praying, right? Before he goes to the garden. But here's the thing I want to highlight is he's explaining why it's so important for us to be one. That the world may believe that you sent me. If we're not one, the world will not believe that. And the glory which you gave me, I have given them that they may be one, even as we are one, I and them and you and me, that they may be perfect in one. Again, why? That the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them as you have loved me. It's not just that God wants us to know that he loves us. He wants you to know that he loves you as much as he loves Jesus, his only begotten Son. And how is the world going to know that? We have to be one. In John 13, right, 34 and 35, Jesus says, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another even as I have loved you. And by this love will the world know you are my disciples. Does the world know you're his disciple? Does the world know that the restoration is his disciples? I don't know about you personally, but collectively as the church, I would say no. So what's missing here? It's that love, it's that oneness. And so where do we go from here is kind of the question. And this is my solution. This is all I'm going to give. Ask God what we should do. I know it's a novel concept, but I think that would be important. What if, without any groups, no groups, people were just willing, because of their love for the Lord, their love for each other, the promise and the hope of Zion, they were willing to come together and meet and ask God some questions that they could agree upon. And I understand how difficult this is. And so I want to real briefly share something that the Lord kind of brought to my attention just Thursday. I happened to be reading in a book of Deuteronomy. I've been studying the Old Testament, and I'm going really slow. And I was in chapter 27. And in chapter 27, Moses tells the people that after you cross the Jordan River and you go into the promised land, I want you to build this altar made of stones, great stones. But he adds on this little bit, and this is what struck me and caused me to go do a little digging. And he said, but I don't want you to use any tool. Don't try to fashion it with your hands. That's not what I'm asking you to do. Just bring the stones. And for some reason, I'm like, gosh, that really is sticking out to me. And so I tried to do some digging and looking at some cross references, and I found two really important references. One is in Exodus 20, when God is giving the Ten Commandments, and he's telling them, you are to make no graven image. You're not to try and make a likeness of me using tools. And then in Exodus 32, when they build the golden calf, it states very clearly, which I think is important, that they shaped it with their hands. And so we have these two different viewpoints, these two different ideologies. And I imagine the people of Israel had some good desires, but they tried to fashion it with their own hands. They tried to make it something. And God is just saying, no, I just want you to bring the stones. You're not supposed to fashion anything. Even if we have a good desire to make something happen, maybe we want to see the church reorganized. And I think we're commanded in a way that that should be happening. But if we try to put our hands to it, and we try to make it happen, we've tainted it. That's what's different. In 1853, they had no desire to organize. That wasn't their intention. God did it. And I feel like this is speaking from maybe a naive person, but all of the previous movements in some way or the other have been an attempt to fashion something, to find a loophole in the law, to make something happen with our own hands. And I want to bring up one last thing to kind of emphasize that, make it practical. A few years ago, I was at Temple Grove's reunion. I was pastoring the reunion at that time. And we had this campfire service. It was a Tuesday night. And for some reason, so the reunion wasn't going super great. I mean, it was pretty good, but there was obviously some issues. And some people were not coming to prayer, or they weren't coming to the campfire. They were skipping it. But this particular prayer, or campfire, I keep wanting to call it prayer service. Heather Joyce was leading us. She finished leading the campfire. And she's going to leave, and then she notices no one's going anywhere. Everyone is staying in their seat, and so she just sits down. And we wait a little bit, and all of a sudden someone stands up and we sing a song. Someone stands up and gives a testimony. Someone stands up and gives a prayer. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. No one was presiding. There was no one up front. And I know Brian was there, and I think some others were. I couldn't believe it. We couldn't have engineered this thing. It was just happening. We had done our part by the campfire, singing the songs so that the Spirit was present. And then God took over. And then the next night, and I was afraid of this, we tried to make it happen again. And it was horrible. It was a bad experience. And I feel like this emphasizes what's really important. I know that we have strong desires. We long to see us become one. We have to be very careful that we're not trying to engineer something with our hands. It's got to be God moving. So that's all that I have. There's some other things I think I might just leave it at that. And so, Daniel, did you want to take over? While you're doing that, I'm going to close that down.
Taking over. Clear as mud. That's a lot. That's a lot to cram into 2 classes over 2 Sunday mornings. And I guess I'll say a few words to kind of summarize and talk about what we take out of all of this, and then leave the rest of the time for discussion and for questions and for you all to share. I'm going to share a few things that I shared after the class in Kirtland. And the first thing is I wanted to bring up an analogy that the Lord brought to me from Matthew chapter 5. That's the Sermon on the Mount. And Christ was speaking to the people, and I know that you're pretty familiar with that probably, and also the context for that. But I want to emphasize the fact that these were a people who were in bondage. So Christ was speaking to the Jews. They were under Roman rule. They were under Roman occupation, enemy occupation. They were in a position where they were taxed and stolen from. And they were even in a position where, if you remember around the time when Jesus was young, there was a king, there was Herod, and he could say, go out and just kill all the baby boys who are 2 years old or younger. And they would go do it, and they would take your child. So they were in this position where they had basically no rights, no freedoms of their own. And they were longing to get out from this situation. They wanted to be able to be an independent people and be in a position where they could worship the Lord the way they wanted to, and be his people and not have to deal with this terrible situation that they were in. And so Christ, they saw him come among them and start doing these miracles. And they saw him feed 5,000 men with just a little boy's lunch. They saw him healing the sick and healing the blind. And they said, there's somebody who could take us out from under the Romans. And he could give us this freedom that we long for. And so Christ comes and he preaches to them. And as you know, he didn't do that. He didn't take them out of that situation, did he? He didn't overthrow the Romans. He didn't give them that freedom that they wanted. But he instead said, you are commanded to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. He commanded them to keep the whole law. He commanded them in Matthew 5:15 and 16. He said, I'm calling you to be the salt of the earth. I'm calling you to be a light to the world. And so in this situation that they were in, he said, not out of this situation, but in these circumstances, I'm calling you to keep my commandments. I'm calling you to save the world. He even gave them this mission, this people that were in bondage. And I see a strong parallel between us today and that situation that they were in at that time. Because growing up in this church, I have often heard and thought about how we are in a situation where we've inherited basically a bad lot, that we're stuck and we need somebody to come save us before we can do what God wants us to do or be what God wants us to be. And in this, I see this parallel that we actually have some freedom, that he's given us everything that we need to keep his commandments. It says, Nephi said, the Lord gives no commandment unto the children of men unless he prepare a way for them to do the things which he has commanded. So I think that in this class, in this material that we've seen over the last 2 Sundays, there's a couple things that jump out at me that we can do. And the first is that I think that we can see, no matter what group you're a part of, that the reorganization that we have come out of thought about priesthood and factional priesthood maybe a little bit differently than we do today in the independent restoration branches. And I think that if we want to reevaluate our position on that, we can, and be still within the laws and commandments of God. And that's all that I'm going to say about that this morning. That's all that I said in Kirtland. I think that that's just a fact. And Andrew actually, in some previous versions of the class, when we had more time, he talked about something called the 1918 Protocol, which was a situation where the RLDS Church and the Temple Lot Church actually said, you know what? We can both trace our priesthood back. We both believe the same thing. We have the same doctrine. And so there's no reason why we can't share priesthood. There's no reason why we can't recognize each other's members as members in good standing. And they had that relationship for many years. And so the RLDS Church viewed, I think, in some ways, priesthood of these different groups differently than we do today. And so I think that if we want to reevaluate that, we can. The second thing, and something that is perhaps even more important as a starting point, is that we are free to treat each other with charity. That we are free to treat each other with love, and we are commanded to treat each other with love. And there will never be a situation that we come across in the world or in this church where we lose our ability to treat others as love would dictate. Love says that we don't leave each other behind, and we saw that in the conference in 1853 that Andrew talked about last week. So they came together, and they thought they were one, and then they very quickly realized they weren't, right? It just completely fell apart. They could not see eye to eye. They were debating and arguing, and it got to the point where Gurley actually said that he wished he would die. And Andrew kind of leaned into this last week when he was talking about it. He asked that he would literally be taken from the earth because he realized that God had asked them to be one. He'd asked them to do this thing, and they were so divided, and the situation was so terrible that there was no way he could see it taking place. But the interesting thing is they kept coming back. See, I feel like today, if we faced that same situation, we would get to a point where we said, fine, we're going to be two different groups. We're going to be two different churches. And they were not willing to accept that reality. So even though it was so dark that he wanted to die, and they knew that there was no way they were going to debate each other into agreement, they just kept coming back. They came back the next day. And ultimately, somebody stood up and rebuked the adversary because they recognized that that condition they were in was not of the Lord. And when the Lord saw that commitment, all of a sudden his spirit fell on that place, and somebody proclaimed, there's angels among us, and things started to change. And the Lord, by his spirit, turned that situation around. And it also makes me think of last year in Kirtland, Richard Neal shared a sermon where he talked about Numbers 32. And in Numbers 32, you have the children of Israel, and they've come to a point where they're getting ready to cross into the promised land and go to battle to claim the promised land after all these years, after 40 years after that generation had passed away that was rebellious. They were finally going to take the land that the Lord had promised them. And there was some of the tribes who said, you know what? This place where we're at right now, on this side of the river, actually isn't so bad. And so we're going to build a city here. We're going to have our families raised here. And you all, the rest of you, you go ahead and go across, and you can fight. That's fine. You can take the land of promise. But we're just content right here. And the way the Lord responded to that is very interesting, because he didn't say, fine, I'll be with the ones who keep my commandment and go to fight, and the ones who stay behind will lose out. He didn't say that. He said, no, if you do this, if you choose to divide as a nation of Israel, then it's not just the ones who stay behind that will lose out, but the entire nation for another generation will not inherit the land of promise. And in all of these things that we've shared, what I see is that division is contrary to the nature and will of God, and is not his desire for us to be divided. So, what is a practical thing we could do? Where have I seen some hope, perhaps. And so I want to share with you just one testimony, and then I'll probably open it up for the time we have left for you guys to discuss. But a couple years ago, I was asked to preside over a special service. And this is something that most of you will be familiar with because you're a part of this. There's 8 branches that get together on a monthly basis to have a Sunday night service together or a Wednesday night service together, right? And outreach is a part of that. And there are 3 branches that are not traditional restoration, independent branches. So there's Central Branch, Gospel Park, and Saints Haven. And those branches, because they know that some will not accept their priesthood, to be a part of this group, they said, go ahead and come, and we will host you. Please come and meet in our building, and we won't preach, we won't preside, but we just want to be able to worship with you, and you can preach and you can preside. And so the first one of these that I was actually a part of, I was asked to preside over. And I didn't know how I felt about that. I come from a pretty conservative background, I'll call it, in the church. So I was trying to work out, how does this work? How do I feel about this kind of gathering? At the same time, as things were even more difficult with this particular gathering because there were some that were a part of the different branches that actually didn't want this service to take place. And so as I'm struggling to kind of figure out how I'm going to preside over this service and who I want to participate from these different branches and what I want them to do, in the background, the pastors of the branches are having this discussion about whether the service is going to go forward at all. And I'll be honest, I got to a point where I really hoped they were going to cancel that service because it seemed like nothing was working out. And I was worried about it. I was nervous about it. And it just didn't seem like things were falling into place at all the way I wanted them to. But I continued to fast. I continued to pray. Ultimately, they decided to go ahead with the service. And I got to that service. I was running around trying to figure out who was helping, where my people were. I didn't think that my special music was there. It seemed like it was a disaster. And so I'm up front getting ready to lead this service. And I actually have the hymnal. I'm paging through it to find an opening hymn in case my introit's not there. When it turned out they actually were there, and they stood up to start to sing. And there was a hymn that I had really, really wanted to sing as a group to open that service. And the hymn was "Sweet the Time, Exceeding Sweet, When the Saints Together Meet." And ultimately I decided, well, I'll just let my introit pick what song that they want to sing. And they started to sing that song. And when they did, the Spirit just fell on me. It was like the Lord said to me, now I'm taking control of this service. And that turned out to be one of the most powerful services that I have ever been a part of. And later, there was a time where I allowed sharing of prayers and testimonies. And the lady who sang that song for my introit, she stood up and she said that the Lord had woken her up in the middle of the night and told her that she was supposed to sing that song, and she had never had that kind of experience before. And so that was an experience that ultimately led me to go to Kirtland last year after not being there for 15 years because of what was going on with the different groups being allowed to participate in that for the first time. And it's the reason that we presented this class in Kirtland this year, and it's the reason we're here today. And so I see that Gospel Park was where this took place, this service. Them having the humility and the love to say, I know that we can't agree on some things, but please let's just come and worship together. That set the stage for me to have this experience and for a lot of other good things to come out of that. I think that we can find a lesson in that. And so those are the things that I wanted to bring out of all of the words that we presented up here over the last 2 weeks. Freedom to do what God has commanded us to do. Freedom to maybe start thinking differently about factional priesthood, freedom to love each other in all things, and to no longer be content with a situation where we divide and try to move forward without being one. So I'll leave it at that. Brian has a comment, and it's now, the floor's open for anybody else who has a comment or a question as well.
Now you guys get a talk, I'm going to leave.
Want to thank you guys for coming, and I've got a lot of things from Remnant and everything else I could share, but really what I would like to share goes along with Andrew's last comment of ask God. And I want to share with you, and I shared this at Kirtland, and it's coming out in the tidings coming up, is that when I was sitting at the closing service in Kirtland, God spoke to me and he said, I am speaking. And I looked back over the entire weekend, and God had spoke to us. That was the reason we gathered. He said that if we were obedient, he would give us further steps, the next direction. And so what I ended up seeing was Riley's message was that we had to become one with God. The next two messages came about repenting individually and corporately. The next one was forgiveness, that we had to be able to forgive. And then these two brothers shared the last message. And so when you see the statement that come out of our follow-up meetings from Kirtland that we've already talked about one time, I believe, it ties right into this. We can't just skip the first several steps and come to the last step where there was a sequence that happened, and I saw God's hand. It was so plain to me, and it went all the way through to this point right here. And so when we end up seeing the statement of agreement, brothers and sisters, this is where we're at as a people. And as we come together to the step 3 was that we're going to go and ask the Lord. And number 4 was we're going to do whatever he says that he wants us to do. And so I wanted to thank you guys. And there's a lot of other things that we could use as a distraction. We don't need to get there. This has been directed by the Lord. This has been directed by the Lord for us. And so we just need to listen to the Lord and follow all of those steps. Don't jump over anything. And Andrew, I never knew about the making it of yourself. Thank you. That was huge.
Thank you, Brian. I agree, and I'm glad that you brought up the other messages that were given at Kirtland as well, because I definitely saw that same progression and the Lord's direction in that, and that's important to know. Yes, sister.
I just want to share my testimony from this week of how reading through what we've been asked to read on what came out of Kirtland, and something that stood out to me was that I would follow my baptismal covenant, and in that supporting those who are going through trials and sufferings, whether physical, temporal, or spiritual. Mm-hmm. And so I read section 17 through the members' responsibilities all the way through the prayers of the sacrament. And something that stood out to me was the prayer of the bread, that my duty as a member is to follow the commandments.
Yes.
So I went back to the same where Andrew was this week in Exodus 20. And to support what Andrew said, it stood out to me also that God he didn't want the altar. He commanded them to build an altar. But the altar could not be made with their hands. It had to be on the dirt, untilled, no rock hewed out of a stone, but it had to be on God's earth. And so I just want to confirm that, which Andrew shared this morning.
Thank you. Yes, there's a comment up here.
When Andrew had the slide up there, John 17:20 through 23, that they all may know, and then he said the reason that the world would know, my mind thought of Blue Springs. On 19th Street was Parkview Branch, which is CLC, but it was one of the 5 fundamental CLC. On 17th Street was Zarahemla. On 18th and 40 was a group that came here and met for a while with us, went to retreats, the Van Vivers and the Clements and different ones. So within 3 streets, within about 5-block area. So what does that tell the world? That we can't get along? We have 3 churches all professing the same thing within that small, you can throw a baseball and hit each one. So that was a poor example for the world that, here was 3 groups all meeting. But, we're so divided throughout, it's not that we have a full church and we need another church, we're so full, like outreach is full, but it's just that we're divided and each one splinters off. But that was kind of a poor example to the world that
Right.
3 groups couldn't get together in close proximity.
Questions on what they presented. This wasn't your experience over at Outreach, was it? You had
There was some, I'll call it lively discussion at times, yes. Brian.
So, how do you use the same theory with the Mormons?
That's a good question.
Well,
for further explaining your question.
because we're saying as long as you can trace your priesthood back to the original church, then it's there. My answer to that is no. There's 3 times that I've been asked to baptize 6th, 7th generation Mormons, and every one of them were told the exact same thing by the Lord, was that they needed to be baptized by one having authority. So I think there's a big difference between 1860s when Joseph said that there were still some authority in the Mormon church, but that's totally different. I think when they got rebaptized, that started a completely new church. And so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out, because if we gotta be careful with some of the lines.
We do. And, there's a spectrum here. Like this lady was talking about a minute ago, where we may have a church that's across the street that aligns with us doctrinally in almost every way. Maybe in every way. We just had a disagreement in the past, and so we're 2 different groups. And it might be easier for us to imagine us becoming one with them again than it is to imagine becoming one with the COC or with the Mormons, as you bring up. And I might have opinions on that or how that takes place or should take place, but I'm not going to go on record as saying that, because I don't believe that that's why Andrew and I are here to present this information today. As Jake said when he introduced us last week, Daniel and Andrew are just here to present information. And I feel like that's that my role and Andrew's role is to present some things and pull out some main points from that, but I don't know that we are here to suggest one way or the other about something like whether we need to unite with the Mormons or accept their priesthood or be baptizing them. Yeah, Jake?
So in June, I became pastor, and as one of my duties, I meet with the other pastors of the different groups, including Gospel Park and Saints Haven and Central Branch. And what I've said multiple times in our meetings, because there are some pastors there that have a large group, I don't know if it's a majority or not, but a large group within their congregation that will not participate in these functions, these Sunday night services or Wednesday night services. And so one of the things that was made clear to me, and what I have voiced multiple times, is if we, within this room of these men, if we find a way where the Lord allows us to start getting together, it will become a pattern, and not 100%, because Brian was right. The LDS rebaptized and reordained 99%. I don't know what percentage didn't, but most of the people that probably didn't receive that ordination or rebaptism have actually come away. And so the LDS has a little bit difference, but it does start to set a pattern in how we act and react with others that will open up new channels on how we interact with these other groups. Because it's not about us being right, but us being in tune to what the Lord wants. And if that's the case, He will show us what we need to do with those steps in reaching out to the other groups. So what I've been of the opinion of as we've met together is that we are learning those patterns and what it is that the Lord's calling us to, and trying to get our groups to respond in like manner. So while right now what's the focus, what's ahead of us, the task ahead is what you've presented. And because of the divisions, it's the groups that we're most aware with, the Remnant and the JCRB. Mm-hmm. And how we are going to interact with them and how we view them. And why we might not agree with certain things, that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that all is lost. And that's what I see out of what you've presented. Now I'll tell the congregation, because the congregation might not know, that when this class was presented in Kirtland, by the end of the day, I'd already texted Benji because I didn't have Andrew's number. And I asked Andrew before the end of that day for you guys to come teach this class. That's how strong I felt about it. And then I think it was either that evening or the next morning, Ray came up to me and said, hey, that class that was taught, what do you think? Do you think that would be good for us? I said, well, I do, because I've already asked them. And then the next morning, Paul Marsh came up to me and said, hey, I was thinking about this all night. He said, what do you think about that class? And so it wasn't just me, but you've also have two other men within the congregation that definitely saw a point of interest and something for us to learn out of what we've been presented the last 2 weeks.
I'm sorry, there's one more thing I'd like to share, because for several years I really contended with South Chrysler, because they very, very strong, Buckner very strong on a very hard line, and I finally got somebody to tell me what the situation is. And so, you know, the harmony agreement that you had mentioned that was taking place between the Temple Lot Church, and we had Danny Height come out here and talk to us about that for 4 weeks too. But in 1926, World Conference was started, and Fred M. said the Harmony Agreement is over because they had ordained apostles.
Yes.
Now, and he said when they had ordained apostles, they started a new church. Mm-hmm. And they were no longer what was considered just a factional group.
Right.
And so I just share that with you because that's where some others are. There's a big difference. Like Andy was saying, why can't we just get together and worship? Sure. We should be able to get together and worship with any denomination, any whatever. When we start talking about authority, that's where some of the other lines get drawn too. And so I just wanted you to know why some people have such a hard line on that, and that was the stance and why things were taken that way.
Yeah. The comment up here.
I may be mistaken in this, but a lot of this, I really appreciate the class. Ultimately, what I'm going to say is the division is very hurtful, and I know that I don't want to be contrary to anyone because I ultimately want to do what's right. So from my experience, this division that has been generated in saying we can't worship with so-and-so, or so-and-so can't ordain so-and-so, or does so-and-so still hold authority? I don't want to say that that's irrelevant, but how has that gotten us any closer to being united? And I'm not saying that there's not a right way to do things, but to continue to do it that way does not feel right because that hasn't produced any fruit. Mm-hmm. Also, I wonder if when the priesthood gets together and they discuss these things, do you take into account the fallout of deciding to draw lines? Do you take into account the people that we say that we want to reach and that Jesus is for the world except for the people that belong to that group? And when you say that, their kids hear that. And kids that are my kids' ages have heard that. Well, we can't have so-and-so come be in charge at camp because blah, blah, blah. And really, I guess I'm pleading with the priesthood to look at everything that affects. If you say we can't let so-and-so come talk at our branch, or we can't do this with that group, that's not working toward unity, and it helps a generation become disinterested or feel excluded. I just, being a mom in these times of 5 children, feel like a lot of this stuff has been about priesthood, but in the meantime, and I know the priesthood wants to do the right thing, but look at what's happening in some of these things. And as far as priesthood authority, does it ever really leave? Once God has given you, just like in the slide, given you the power and you've been ordained to that, how can we say they're no longer valid? I mean, I'm a baptized member, I'll never hold priesthood. But if you told me because I was part of a different group, even though I was baptized in the church, that now I'm not a relevant member and I can't participate in member activities because I'm part of a different group, that does not make sense. Anyway, I don't know if what I said made sense. I'm pretty passionate about
It's very well
about
said.
unity.
Yes. Jake wants to comment as well. I think it's well said. I think more and more we're recognizing that we're tasting the bitter fruit that has come out from some of these decisions that have been made, maybe with good intentions. I think you're right. And there's a recognition of that. And perhaps that's why Andrew and I are being invited to go around to different groups and share. It's a difficult situation. I appreciate what you said about you not being recognized as a member, because that's a thing now too. As you look around and you see different groups saying, we will no longer serve sacrament to people who associate with this group or with that group or with this other group, you're invalidating that eternal covenant that that person has made. A lot of times with people that you've worshiped with your whole life. Jake?
I can tell you that over the past 2 to 3 years that there is a change. I can't fully articulate it, but something is happening. And it was brought to this congregation a couple of years ago that because the groups are starting to wane in membership, maybe we need to look at some form of coming together. And if we're doing it because we have no other choice, I wasn't good with following that. If you're telling me because we're losing numbers, they're losing numbers, everybody's losing numbers, so we have to come together because we have to find out something to do, I wasn't good with that. And the kids at CPRS were explained in that they're suffering. The reality of what is going on is what Andrew articulated right at the end. This movement that's happening, this thing, that it's God moving, it's not men moving. And what I see is I see men that are starting to perk up and listen. And so what I've seen over the several years, and I could be wrong in my perception, but what I've seen is that since we came out of the church, the organization in 1984, somewhere along the lines, the most important thing that we could do was protect the doctrine and keep it pure. And I don't know if that's true, but that's my perception of it. And in keeping it pure, what that means is we have to shut out others. And I know that this has been going around through some priesthood men. It's almost like we had the one talent and we buried it in the sand. Now, if you let that soak in and you look at kind of where we're at, it kind of feels that way. We didn't share Christ. We didn't share the gospel. We had to keep it pure and untainted. And I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not pointing fingers. It's just what seems to have happened. 2 years ago, I had a vision. And in this vision, I saw myself sitting looking at this little cottage. And I can remember it looked like a stucco cottage with the heavy beams sticking out. And it was on the edge of a field, and I can see a warm flicker, and I couldn't tell you if it was a candle or a fire. But I understood that it was the Lord, that he wasn't asleep, but he was attending to other things, and that he knew what was happening. And as I looked to the side of the field, there were sheep. And I can remember seeing approximately 5 shepherds, not counting myself. I understood myself to be a shepherd, but I was in observation. And this field was fenced on 3 sides. And on the 4th side, it was edged up to the woods. And over a period of time, the sheep started wandering down into the woods. And the shepherds just went along with the sheep. Wherever the sheep went, the shepherds kept them. They stayed with them. And they went deeper and deeper into the forest until they found themselves in a meadow. And at this point, the woods, the forest had become very dark. And the sheep were completely unaware of where they were at. And as I looked around the edge of the tree line, I can see those little glowing, beady eyes looking at the sheep. The entire time, the shepherds were attending to the flock, but yet weren't directing. They just followed the sheep. And then one of the shepherds looked up and realized the danger that the flock was in. And he began to alert the other shepherds. And so they began to wake up and understand that at this point, they have to get the sheep back to where they belong. Now, I understand that there are different ideas that might come out of that, but we are in a very dangerous and perilous time. And what I would suggest is that the shepherds are beginning to be aware and awaken, and they are ready to do what the Lord is wanting them to do to get those sheep back in the field.
Thank you, Jake. It's 10:55. Do you want to keep going, or what time do we need to end?
Do you have any questions or anything pertinent that need to be addressed before we adjourn for the day?
Brother Drew.
A couple things real quick. One is I really like what Mrs. Sinclair had to say here a few moments ago, because one of my brothers, one of my nephews, was Latter-day Saint, priesthood, but of a different persuasion, and they were excluded there at Kirtland on the taking the communion, and in other ways excluded. Now, that wasn't my decision, that was their decision, and they did suffer the consequences. I was just curious, well, the other night, Friday night, I went to an Interfaith Book of Mormon thing up at the Mormon Stake Center on the Temple lot, and I really thought the fellowship was wonderful there. And I saw some restoration people there. The other thing is, on these meetings you've been having, been invited to the different branches around, I assume it's around Jackson County, is that correct?
We'll go wherever we're invited.
Okay.
But yes, it's been in Jackson County.
Yeah. Has that been more divisive, or has it been a good thing, and has it been a positive or a negative?
Just my own impression, and I think that most of our audience so far has been folks who are open to these ideas already. We've only done it one other time here in the Center Place, and that was at Outreach. And there was some who were there who had some concerns, and those were discussed a little bit. But overall, it's not been too contentious, no. I thank you guys for allowing Andrew and I to come over the last couple weeks again, and appreciate your attention. And I would just leave you with something that jumped out at me as Jake was sharing a minute ago. The Lord is aware of where we are. And he and I have had some discussions about that lately, because we're not always happy about where we are, but God is aware, and that he has not asked us to do anything that he will not give us the ability to do. In any situation, remember that if you can do nothing else, you can still treat your brother or your sister with charity, and you can do all that love dictates you would do. Thank you.